Good morning, Nigeria, and Happy New Month to you all. Let's take a look at the top stories dominating today's newspaper headlines. First, we'll start from the Daily Sun newspaper. On the Daily Sun newspaper, which is boldly written on page 6, 2027, APC seals fate of senators, other aspirants who lost primaries. To get that full story, go to page 6 of the Daily Sun newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 26, still on 2027, INEC uploads Obi name to portal as NDC candidates. To get that full story, go to page 26 of the Daily Sun newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 8, Obi urges INEC to publish certificates of candidates. The presidential candidate for the NDC, Peter Obi, is urging INEC to publish certificates of candidates. To get that full story, go to page 8 of the newspaper. Pope Leo XIV appoints Archbishop Martins to Vatican dicastery. To get that full story, go to page 27 of the newspaper. Still at the bottom of the newspaper on page 6, federal government scraps JSS, SSS structure, introduces 12 years continuous basic education. So the federal government wants to scrap junior secondary school and senior secondary school structures and want to introduce 12-year continuous basic education. To get that full story, go to page 6 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust newspaper. On the Daily Trust newspaper on page 3 and 4, which is boldly written, questions over Patum Council. At the top of the newspaper, Niger Varsity students block Vice Chancellor, protest robbery attacks. To get that full story, go to page 3 of the newspaper. Still at the top of the newspaper, federal government to demand compensation for abandoned Nigerian businesses in South Africa. To get that full story, go to page 2 of the Daily Trust newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, how 23 Sokoto residents, KB youths, died in road crashes. This is a very sad news. To get that full story, go to page 6 of the Daily Trust newspaper. Away from that newspaper to The Guardian. On The Guardian, which is written on page 6, coastal states worry as floods disrupt Lagos economy amid disease fears. To get that full story, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on page 3, NDC granted access to INEC portal for uploads. To get that full story, go to page 3 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, violence, tension in South Africa as federal government evacuates 271, seeks compensation for Nigerians. We just hope that we're able to compensate the Nigerians who are back to their country from South Africa. To get that full story, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. Still at the bottom of the newspaper, INEC worries over vote buying ahead of Osun polls. INEC worries over vote buying ahead of Osun polls. To get that full story, go to page 5 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to The Punch. On The Punch newspaper, which is boldly written on page 2 on xenophobia, Nigerian embassy packed 269 return as South African protests rise. So the protest is still rising as Nigerian embassy has evacuated 269 Nigeria. To get that full story, go to page 2 of the Punch newspaper. At the top of the newspaper on Bonu adoption, parents list 36 missing children as youth protest. To get that full story, go to page 7 of the Punch newspaper. NDC uploads Obi Dixon as INEC restores portal access. To get that full story, go to page 30 of the Punch newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, flood waters submerge homes, disrupt power supply in Lagos. Flood water submerged home and it has destroyed power supply in Lagos State. To get that full story, go to page 4 and 5 of the newspaper. 79,323 killed, 34,000 773 adopted in Nigeria in 6 years. So for over 6 years, 79,323 has been killed and 34,773 have been adopted in Nigeria. This is coming from a report. To get that story, go to page 7 of the Punch newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent. On the Daily Independent newspaper, which is boldly written there, Civil War roots causes still active in Nigeria. This is coming from Obasanjo, the former Nigerian president. Says civil war roots causes still active in Nigeria. At the top of the newspaper, federal government considers scrapping policy separating JSS and SSS. To get that full story, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. Still at the top of the newspaper, INEC restores NDC nomination portal access, says this thing. This is still on INEC restoring NDC nomination portal access. To get that full story, you go to page 4 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, still on xenophobia, federal government engages South Africa on safety of Nigerians awaiting evacuation. We hope that the remaining Nigerians that are in South Africa will be evacuated back to their country. To get that full story, go to page 33 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Matrix. On the Matrix, which is boldly written on page 2, Lagos underwater. Commuters, businesses count losses. At the top of the newspaper on page 3, Federal Road Safety Corps, NITTT, seal landmark path to revolutionize transport training, road safety. To get that full story, you go to page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, on 2027 election, opposition parties' preparation hits top gear. Upload candidate details to INEC portal. To get that full story, go to page 3 of the Matrix newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper on entertainment, Portable to renew boxing rivalry with Charles Okocha. This will be so interesting to watch. To get that full story, go to page 23 of the newspaper. On sports, World Cup, France, Norway dump out Sweden, Cote d'Ivoire. To get that full story, go to page 25 of the Matrix newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph, which is boldly written on page 2 and 6, still on xenophobic attacks. Federal government to demand compensation for fleeing Nigerians. At the top of the newspaper, value of Nigerian natural gas shipment to Europe, Asia hit $8.6 billion. To get that full story, go to page 3 of the New Telegraph paper. At the bottom of the newspaper, federal government, new education policy will prevent 20 million dropouts between primary and GSS levels. To get that full story, go to page 3 and 27 of the newspaper. Still at the bottom of the newspaper, Troop loses Supreme Court battle to end birthright citizenship. Troop loses Supreme Court battle to end birthright citizenship. To get that full story, go to page 14 of the New Telegraph paper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. On the Daily Monitor, which is boldly written, how Tinubu averted Nigeria's economy from collapse. Coming from Oyedele, saying that how Tinubu averted Nigeria's economy from collapse. How true is this? At the top of the newspaper, still on Obi to INEC, this is coming from Obi to INEC, saying that they should publish certificates of candidates to boost public confidence in electoral processes. So the presidential candidate for the NDC is sending message to INEC that they should publish certificates of candidates to boost his public confidence in the 2027 electoral processes. At the bottom of the newspaper, sustainable businesses key to jobs creation, economic growth. Coming from NECA, sustainable businesses key to jobs creation, economic growth. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Eso. Do have a beautiful day.